The sudden wail of an infant pierced the silence of the lonely cabin as Quincy O'Malley paced the worn floorboards, his weathered face etched with desperation. It was the spring of 1878, and the Montana Territory wilderness seemed to amplify every cry of his 3-month-old daughter. Moonlight streamed through the cabin's single window as he bounced the swaddled infant against his shoulder, his large calloused hands awkward against her tiny form. "Hush now, little Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of attempted soothing. "Your pa ain't much good at this, is he?" The baby only wailed louder, her tiny face reddening with the effort. Quincy hadn't slept properly in days, not since the fever had taken his wife just 6 weeks after Sarah's birth. He'd been a man of action all his life, breaking horses, driving cattle, defending his homestead, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness he felt facing his daughter's inconsolable cries. A knock at the door startled him. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially after nightfall. Adjusting the crying baby to one arm, his other hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip as he approached the door. "Who's there?" he called, voice tense with wariness. "It's Violet Gardner from the Mackenzie place," came the reply, barely audible above Sarah's cries. "I was passing by and heard the baby. Is everything all right?" Quincy hesitated before unlatching the door. The Mackenzie ranch was over 5 miles away, and though he recognized the name, he couldn't recall meeting the woman. Opening the door revealed a young woman with auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet. Her dress was simple but clean, and despite the late hour, her green eyes were alert and concerned. "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. O'Malley," she said, her gaze moving to the crying infant. "I was returning from delivering medicines to the Wilsons when I heard the crying. I thought perhaps you might need assistance." Quincy stood speechless for a moment, exhaustion clouding his thoughts. "Been like this for hours," he finally managed. "Can't get her to settle." Violet stepped forward cautiously. "May I?" she asked, extending her arms. Too tired to be suspicious, Quincy surrendered his daughter to the stranger's care. Violet took the baby with practiced ease, cradling her close and examining her with gentle fingers. "When did she last eat?" she asked, moving further into the cabin. "'Bout an hour ago. Goat's milk from Widow Jenkins' nanny," he replied, closing the door. "She took it well enough, but started up crying right after." Violet nodded, feeling the baby's forehead. "She doesn't seem feverish. Has she been changed?" A flush crept up Quincy's neck. "Yes, madam. Done everything I know to do. Sometimes babies just need to cry," Violet said softly, beginning to sway with Sarah. Then, to Quincy's surprise, she began to hum a gentle melody. The tune was familiar, a hymn his mother used to sing, "Amazing Grace." As Violet's humming continued, the baby's cries began to soften. The young woman moved around the cabin, still swaying, still humming, her voice growing slightly stronger as she began to sing the words softly. Quincy watched, transfixed, as his daughter's cries diminished to whimpers, then to occasional hiccups, and finally, miraculously, ceased altogether. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, then closed, her tiny body relaxing in Violet's arms. "How did you do that?" he whispered, afraid to break the spell. Violet smiled gently. "My sister had 4 little ones. I helped raise them after she fell ill." A shadow crossed her face. "She passed last winter." "I'm sorry," Quincy said, meaning it. Death was a constant companion on the frontier. "My Elizabeth." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Violet said quietly. "Mrs. Wilson told me. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. O'Malley." They stood in silence, the sleeping baby between them like a fragile bridge. After a moment, Violet carefully moved toward the rough-hewn cradle in the corner. "May I?" she asked again. Quincy nodded, watching as she tenderly laid Sarah down, tucking the homespun blanket around her tiny form. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her breath coming in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. "You have a gift, Miss Gardner," Quincy said, his voice rough with gratitude. Violet turned to face him, and in the lamplight, he noticed the freckles dusting her nose and the kindness in her eyes. "Not a gift, Mr. O'Malley. Just practice and patience." She glanced around the cabin, noting the stack of unwashed dishes, the pile of laundry, the general disarray of a man trying to manage alone with an infant. "Would you permit me to help you set things right before I continue on my way?" Pride warred with practicality in Quincy's exhausted mind. "I couldn't ask that of you, Miss Gardner. It's already late, and you've done more than enough."
"You didn't ask."
I offered. Her smile was warm but determined. "And it's not proper for me to travel alone in the dark anyway. I had planned to make camp nearby until morning." Quincy looked alarmed. "Camp? Alone? There are wolves and worse out there, not to mention drifters." "I've managed before," she said simply, already rolling up her sleeves. "Now, where do you keep your washing basin?" 2 hours later, the cabin bore little resemblance to the chaotic space Violet had entered. Dishes were washed, clothes folded, floors swept, and a simple stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with its savory aroma. Quincy sat at the table, watching this capable woman move around his home, as if she belonged there. She hadn't stopped to rest, despite his protests. There was something both unsettling and deeply comforting about her presence. "You should eat something before it gets cold," Violet said, setting a bowl before him. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Quincy couldn't remember. The days since Elizabeth's death had blurred together in a haze of grief and baby cries. "Thank you," he said, taking up the spoon. The first taste nearly brought tears to his eyes, not because it was particularly remarkable, but because it represented a kindness he'd almost forgotten existed. Violet sat across from him with her own bowl, and they ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove and Sarah's soft breathing from the cradle. "Where will you go tomorrow?" Quincy asked eventually. "Back to the Mackenzies. I help Mrs. Mackenzie with household matters and care for Mr. Mackenzie's mother. She's bedridden with rheumatics." Violet's expression grew thoughtful. "Mr. O'Malley, have you considered what you'll do with Sarah when you need to tend your livestock or work your fields?" The question hit like a physical blow. It was one he'd been avoiding. "Been taking her with me when I can, leaving her in the cabin when I must." His voice tightened. "It ain't ideal." "No, it isn't," Violet agreed, her tone gentle but direct. "A baby needs consistent care, especially one so young." "You think I don't know that?" Defensive anger flared briefly. "I'm doing the best I can." "I know you are," Violet said softly, "which is why I'd like to make you a proposal." Quincy raised an eyebrow, suddenly wary. "I could come by 3 times a week to help with Sarah and the housekeeping. In exchange, perhaps you could provide me with some of your farm's produce for the Mackenzies' table and assistance with their heavier work when needed. Mr. Mackenzie's back injury limits what he can do." It was a practical arrangement, one that would benefit them both, yet Quincy hesitated. Accepting help felt like admitting failure. "I don't need charity, Miss Gardner." "It isn't charity when both parties benefit, Mr. O'Malley. It's community." Her green eyes held his steadily. "Isn't that why people settle near each other out here? So we don't have to face the wilderness alone." Before he could respond, Sarah stirred in her cradle, making the small fussing sounds that usually preceded full-blown crying. Violet was on her feet instantly, reaching the cradle before him. Once again, she lifted the baby with practiced ease and began to hum the same hymn. Sarah quieted almost immediately, her tiny hand curling around Violet's finger. Watching them, Quincy felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and worry he'd carried since Elizabeth's death. Maybe it was exhaustion breaking down his defenses, or maybe it was the simple truth of Violet's words about community, but he found himself nodding. 3 times a week, he agreed. "And I'll bring my team over to help plow Mackenzie's south field." It needs doing if he's going to plant the season. Violet's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. It's settled then. I'll come back the day after tomorrow. True to her word, Violet returned 2 days later, arriving just as Quincy was struggling to feed Sarah while simultaneously trying to prepare his own breakfast. She didn't comment on the renewed chaos, but simply hung her bonnet on a peg, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work. This began a pattern that stretched through the spring and into summer. 3 days a week, Violet would arrive at the O'Malley homestead, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes for the entire day depending on Sarah's needs and the work to be done. She brought order to the cabin and peace to the baby, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, she began to bring something else to Quincy, a sense of possibility. He found himself looking forward to her visits, planning tasks they could do together, saving stories to tell her about his day. He noticed things about her, the way she always tucked a wildflower into Sarah's cradle, how she hummed different hymns depending on her mood, the small scar near her right eyebrow from a childhood fall. One warm July afternoon, they sat on the cabin's front porch shelling peas, Sarah sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. The comfortable silence between them had become familiar, but today Quincy found himself wanting to know more about the woman who had become such an essential part of their lives. "How'd you come to be with Mackenzies?" he asked. "You mentioned your sister passed. Do you have other family?" Violet's fingers stilled momentarily on the pea pods. "No living family. My parents died of cholera when I was 16. My sister Grace raised me after that, but after she passed, her husband didn't see a place for me in their home." Her voice held old pain. "Mrs. Mackenzie was a friend of Grace's. She offered me a position and a roof." "That husband of your sister's sounds like a fool," Quincy said bluntly. A small smile curved Violet's lips. "He's not a bad man. Just overwhelmed with 4 children and a farm to run. And I wasn't his responsibility." "Still ain't right to turn away family," Quincy insisted. Violet resumed her shelling. "Life rarely gives us what's right, Mr. O'Malley. Just opportunities to make the best of what we have." She glanced at him, "Like you're doing with Sarah." Her quiet approval warmed him more than it should have. "Been thinking of fixing up the cabin," he said, changing the subject. "Adding another room now that Sarah's growing. Maybe a proper kitchen for—" He stopped himself, suddenly aware of the implication. "For what?" Violet prompted. "For the future," he finished awkwardly. "A growing homestead needs a proper kitchen." Violet nodded, but something in her expression had shifted, becoming more guarded. "It's good to plan ahead." The conversation drifted to safer topics: the weather, the crops, news from town, but something had changed between them. A possibility had been acknowledged, if only obliquely. That evening, after Violet had left and Sarah was asleep, Quincy sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. He thought of Elizabeth, of the future they'd planned together, of the promises made and broken by her early death. He felt the familiar ache of loss, but for the first time, it was tempered by something else, not happiness exactly, but perhaps the hope of it. When Violet arrived the following week, she brought troubling news. "The Mackenzies are selling their place," she said as she helped Quincy hang laundry on the line. "Mr. Mackenzie's cousin in Oregon has offered him a partnership in a mercantile. They leave in 2 weeks." Quincy felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "And you? Will you be going with them?" Violet secured a sheet to the line before answering. "Mrs. Mackenzie has offered to take me along. She says I'm like family now." Her eyes met his briefly before darting away. "I haven't given my answer yet." Sarah, now able to sit up on her own, babbled happily from her blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree. At 6 months old, she had Quincy's dark hair and Elizabeth's blue eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. Violet glanced at her with undisguised affection. "She'll miss you," Quincy said, then added more softly, "We both will." Violet's hands stilled on the laundry. I've become quite attached to her, too. She hesitated. To both of you, if I'm being honest. The admission hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Quincy searched for the right words, but caution and doubt held him back. Was it too soon after Elizabeth? Would it dishonor her memory to speak of feelings for another woman? And what if Violet didn't share those feelings beyond the natural affection that had grown from caring for his child? Oregon's a long way, he finally said. Yes, Violet agreed. A very long way. The conversation ended there, both of them returning to the task at hand, but the unspoken question remained. What would happen when the Mackenzies left? The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, a summer thunderstorm rolled across the valley, bringing wind and lightning that split the sky. Quincy was in the barn, securing the livestock, when he heard a horse approaching at a gallop despite the dangerous weather. It was Jed Wilson's boy, rain-soaked and breathless. "Pa sent me to fetch you, Mr. O'Malley," the lad shouted over the storm. "There's a fire at the Mackenzie place." Lightning struck the barn, and it's spreading fast. Cold fear gripped Quincy's heart. "Violet, is she safe?" "Don't know, sir. Pa just said to get all the men we can." Quincy didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse, instructed the boy to stay with Sarah, and rode out into the storm, pushing his mount harder than was wise on the slick terrain. By the time he reached the Mackenzie ranch, the barn was fully engulfed, and flames were licking at the main house. Men from neighboring homesteads formed a bucket brigade from the well to the house, fighting desperately to save it. "Where's Violet?" Quincy demanded, dismounting and grabbing a bucket. Inside, someone shouted. Mackenzie's mother couldn't be moved. Without thinking, Quincy dropped the bucket and ran toward the house, ignoring the shouts behind him. Smoke billowed from the doorway, but he plunged through it, pulling his bandana over his mouth. "Violet," he called, coughing as the smoke filled his lungs. "Violet, where are you?" "In here." Her voice came from the back bedroom, strained but steady. Quincy found her kneeling beside an elderly woman's bed, trying to lift the frail figure. Mrs. Mackenzie and her husband were nowhere to be seen. "The roof's about to go," Quincy warned, moving quickly to help. "We need to get out now." Together, they managed to get the elderly Mrs. Mackenzie onto a quilt that could be used as a makeshift stretcher. They were halfway to the door when a burning rafter crashed down behind them, blocking their retreat. "This way," Violet coughed, steering them toward a window. "It's our only chance." Quincy smashed the window with his boot, clearing the glass as best he could. He climbed through first, then helped pass the older woman out to waiting hands. As he reached back for Violet, another section of the ceiling collapsed. "Violet," he screamed, trying to re-enter the burning room. Strong hands pulled him back just as Violet appeared at the window, her face streaked with soot, her clothing singed. With a final desperate effort, she climbed through, falling into Quincy's arms as the roof of the house caved in with a deafening crash. They collapsed together on the wet ground, coughing and gasping for clean air as the rain pelted down on them. Quincy held her tightly, his heart hammering with fear and relief. "Thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair. Violet's arms tightened around him. "I'm here," she whispered back. "I'm still here." They stayed that way until the immediate danger had passed, reluctant to let go even when others came to check on them. Mrs. Mackenzie's mother had been taken to a neighboring farm for care, and the Mackenzies themselves were safe, though their home and barn were complete losses. As dawn broke the next morning, Quincy and Violet sat on the porch of a neighbor's home, watching as the last embers of the Mackenzie place smoldered in the distance. They were exhausted, smoke-stained, but alive. Sarah slept peacefully in Violet's lap, having been brought over by Jed Wilson's boy once the storm had passed. "The Mackenzies are still planning to leave for Oregon," Violet said quietly. "Sooner now, with nothing to sell." Mr. Mackenzie says they can stay with his brother in town until they're ready to depart. Quincy nodded, his eyes on her face rather than the distant ruins. And you? Have you decided? Violet stroked Sarah's dark hair, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Mackenzie still wants me to come along. Says I'm practically family and they can use the help establishing their new life. Is that what you want? Quincy asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Violet looked up at him then, her green eyes steady despite the faint tremble of her lips. What I want, she said carefully, is a home. People to care for who care for me in return. A place to belong. She took a deep breath. I thought I had found that here, but I'm not sure now if I was seeing things that weren't there. Quincy understood what she was asking. In the months since she had first appeared at his door, she had become essential to his life, to Sarah's life. The thought of her leaving created a hollow feeling that frightened him more than the burning building had. You were seeing true, he said simply. I just wasn't brave enough to speak it. Hope flickered in her eyes. And now I know what it would mean to lose you, and I can't bear it. He reached for her free hand, enveloping it in his larger one. Stay, Violet. Not as hired help, not as a neighbor, but as... He hesitated, then pushed through his uncertainty. As my wife, if you'll have me. Help me raise Sarah. Build a life together. Tears welled in Violet's eyes, catching the early morning sunlight. Are you certain, Quincy? It hasn't been very long since Elizabeth. It was the first time she had called him by his given name, and hearing it from her lips felt right. Elizabeth would want Sarah to have a mother who loves her, and she'd want me to find happiness again. He squeezed her hand gently. I've found both with you. Violet glanced down at the sleeping baby in her lap, then back at Quincy. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. Yes, I'll stay. I'll be Sarah's mother. And your wife. Relief and joy washed through Quincy. He leaned forward, mindful of the sleeping baby between them, and kissed Violet for the first time, a gentle, tender kiss that held promises of deeper passion to come. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Sarah cooing happily in Widow Jenkins' arms and the remaining neighbors gathered to witness their union. The Mackenzies delayed their departure for Oregon by a few days to attend, Mrs. Mackenzie dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony. I knew it from the moment I suggested you check on that crying baby, she confided to Violet afterward. Some things are just meant to be. That night, after Sarah had been tucked into her cradle in the newly constructed nursery addition to the cabin, Quincy and Violet stood together on their porch, looking out at the land that was now truly theirs together. I never thought I'd find this again, Quincy said, his arm around his new wife's waist. A family, a future to look forward to. Violet leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. Nor I. After losing my sister, I thought perhaps a solitary life was my fate. She looked up at him, her face soft in the moonlight. I'm glad I was wrong. As am I, he murmured, bending to kiss her. Their kiss deepened, growing heated with the promise of their wedding night ahead, until a familiar cry broke the stillness. Sarah was awake and making her displeasure known. Violet laughed softly against Quincy's lips. Some things never change. They went inside together, hand in hand, to tend to their daughter. As Quincy watched, Violet lifted Sarah from her cradle, cradling her close as she began to hum the hymn that had first worked its magic months ago. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me, she sang softly. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Sarah's cries gradually subsided as the gentle melody filled the cabin. Quincy moved closer, encircling both his wife and daughter in his arms, adding his deeper voice to the hymn. Violet looked up at him with surprise and delight, and together they continued the song until Sarah's eyes fluttered closed once more. Even after the baby slept, they stood together, reluctant to break the perfect moment. Quincy marveled at how his life had transformed from despair to joy in the span of a few months, all because a kind-hearted woman had heard a baby's cry and stopped to help. "I love you, Violet O'Malley," he whispered, the new name still fresh and wonderful on his tongue. "And I love you," she replied, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "Both of you, with all my heart." As they carefully laid Sarah back in her cradle, Quincy knew with absolute certainty that the cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, filled with love and the promise of a future brighter than he had dared to hope for. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the expanded O'Malley homestead as 5-year-old Sarah chased her 3-year-old brother Thomas around the newly built gazebo. Violet watched from the porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their third child grew, the other holding a glass of lemonade to combat the summer heat. "They're going to wear themselves out before the guests arrive," she commented as Quincy joined her, wiping sweat from his brow after finishing his chores. "That might be a blessing," he chuckled, dropping a kiss on her cheek. "Especially if Jed Wilson brings his twins again. Those 4 together could stampede a herd of buffalo." Violet smiled, leaning into her husband's solid presence. The years had been good to them. The original cabin had expanded into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and the gazebo Quincy had built as a surprise for their 3rd anniversary. Their cattle herd had grown, and the fields produced enough to sell the surplus in town. Most precious of all were the children, Sarah, who had Elizabeth's blue eyes but Violet's quick mind and gentle heart, Thomas, who was his father's son through and through, from his dark curls to his love of horses, and now the new baby, due before the first snow. "Are you feeling all right?" Quincy asked, his hand covering hers on her belly. "Not overdoing it with the preparations?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "Mrs. Peterson and her daughters are bringing most of the food, and Sarah helped me set the tables earlier." The gathering plan for that afternoon was to celebrate the completion of the new schoolhouse. Quincy had donated both lumber and labor, while Violet had been instrumental in finding a teacher willing to come to their growing community. It was a point of pride for both of them that Sarah would receive the education that circumstances had limited for them.
Ma.
"Look what I found," Sarah called, running toward them with something cupped carefully in her small hands. Thomas toddled behind her, trying to keep up on his shorter legs. "Careful now," Quincy cautioned as Sarah bounded up the porch steps. "What treasure have you discovered?" Sarah opened her hands to reveal a tiny blue bird, its wing clearly injured. "It fell from its nest," she explained, her expression solemn with concern. "Can we help it?" Violet smiled at her daughter's compassion. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's find a box to make a safe place for it until its wing heals." As they tended to the injured bird together, making a nest of soft cloth in a small wooden box and finding seeds for it to eat, Quincy watched his family with a heart full of gratitude. From the darkest moment of his life alone with a crying baby he didn't know how to comfort had come this abundance of love and joy. Later that evening, after their guests had departed and Thomas had been tucked into bed, Quincy found Violet in Sarah's room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, humming softly as she stroked their daughter's hair. It was the same hymn she had sung that very first night, the melody that had brought peace to a crying baby and hope to a grieving father. Sarah's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she smiled when she saw him in the doorway. "Papa," she murmured, "come sing with Mama." Quincy joined them, sitting on the other side of the small bed. Together, they finished the hymn, their voices blending in the familiar harmony they had perfected over the years. When Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, they quietly left her room, closing the door softly behind them. In the hallway, Quincy pulled Violet into his arms, mindful of her pregnant belly. 5 years ago, I thought my life was over, he said softly, pressing his forehead to hers. Now I can't imagine how it could be fuller. Violet's hands came up to frame his face, her touch as gentle now as it had been the first time she held their daughter. From a baby's cry to all of this, she marveled. Grace really is amazing, isn't it? Quincy's answer was a kiss, tender and passionate all at once, a kiss that spoke of the past they had shared and the future still unfolding before them, as vast and promising as the western sky above their home.